Reaper 6.37 is here. It comes with some great additions. We've got improvements to the stock plugins, Delta Solo for any effect, a new limiter effect, and much more. And as usual, this free update includes a bunch of bug fixes to most aspects of Reaper, including MIDI editing, automation, metering, reascript, and other areas. Let's check it out. I have covered almost all of the updates in Reaper since Reaper 5.0, so if you missed anything in the series, there will be a link in the description of this video to take you to the full playlist. And if you like what I'm doing here with the Reaper blog, please consider being a patron or YouTube member. Links to that will be down below as well. All right, so the first small change is affecting freezing muted items, and this is from the 6.36 update. The changelog says, freeze, add option in preferences rendering to generate muted silent items from muted source items. So if we open up the preferences and go to the rendering page, we're going to see this new option, freeze muted items into muted silent items. Let's first look at how that would work without that turned on. So I'll just select these items and mute them. I'll right click on the item and go to freeze, and we're going to freeze to a stereo track. So in this case, the muted items disappear and it's just the item there that was audible. Let's undo that and open up the preferences and check that box. Freeze muted items into muted silent items. And again, we're going to right click, render freeze tracks, freeze to a stereo track. And in this case, it's kept in that silent area so that we can look at this and see that that area was muted previously. Personal preference, I don't think you can go wrong either way. But if you mute a lot of items and then you want to know where you had previously muted them and seeing that in your frozen items, it seems like a good option. And the first change that we're going to look at in 6.37 is with effects. Support Delta Solo, the difference between dry and wet signal for VST, LV2, audio unit, and JSFX. Enable Delta Solo via Alt-click or right-click on wet-dry knob, or in the I/O menu of the pin connector dialog, and add action to toggle Delta Solo for last focused effects. So Delta Solo is a way you can hear what an effect is doing, taking the input signal and the output signal, flipping the output signal polarity, and then you get to solo what has been changed. So it's like band solo on an EQ. Certain EQs have that. It's like having this output clicks only button in RxD click, or the GR delta function in TDR Nova, or the band solo function here. And so let's hear this on a bass. Here's a bass sound. So turn up the mids. I don't hear just this frequency. Let's turn on Delta Solo. And if the plugin isn't doing any processing, the input and the output are the same, you hear silence, just like the classic phase invert trick. And what's cool is this works on any plugin now, not just the plugins that have this built in. Let's take something like Decapitator. Turn on Delta Solo. And actually, with some plugins like this, you get these new alternative tones that sound pretty cool on their own, where you might not easily get to that sort of result without that solo function. So yeah, Delta Solo, it's a great addition to Reaper, very easy to use and very useful. A couple of things to keep in mind with this. If you solo one thing, let's say we do Delta Solo on this plugin, it's still going through everything else in the chain. And so you're not just hearing this effect soloed, it will affect any post-processing, anything else in the chain, any routing. Maybe that's something that they'll add in, like a Delta Solo ignoring routing or something like that. So it goes right to the master track or right to your monitoring, and that would be another useful feature. Up next, let's talk about the FX pin connector. Change track channel count via dropdown rather than plus minus buttons. Support changing plugin channel count, multi-mono, multi-stereo configuration for Reaper effects that support it. So if we take a plugin and we go to the I/O button, the 2 in, 2 out button in this instance of ReEQ, and we can change the track channels here and the plugin channel count here. And so you can easily choose from any of the channels. Let's say that this has 50 channels, and that will automatically expand to show all of that, even with a scroll bar, or put it back to 2 or 4 channels. With this one, it shows it as multi-mono. I'll show you here in ReaLimit, which is a new one we'll get to later on. But in this one, we have options for stereo, multi-mono, multi-stereo. And if we change the channel count, we have multi-channel, multi-mono, and multi-stereo. So with the Dynamics plugins, you'll see multi-channel options, multi-mono, and multi-stereo. The easiest way to demonstrate this is if you have 2 hard pan sounds and they have a different rhythm, both signals will affect the gain reduction happening. That's in multi-channel or multi-stereo mode. With multi-mono mode, each channel is processed independently. Multi-stereo, if you have, let's say, 6 channels on a track, it'll be channels 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, grouped stereo processing. Most users will not use this stuff, but it is interesting that they've added it if you work with multi-channel audio for surround, ambisonic, and stuff like that, where you've got 6 or more channels and you need to process them the same way to keep phase coherency and all that. It's useful to have multi-channel functions and kind of consolidate a lot of different plugin instances into one. I've got the kick on the left and the snare on the right. It's a weird example, but it shows where this difference can crop up. Right now with multi-stereo mode, whether the kick or the snare happens or is detected on the detector passing the threshold, that's where you'll see gain reduction happening. We also have the option of choosing the metering for a lot of the Reaper plugins here now. So if this has a 6-channel track, we can choose which channel is coming into the metering of this. So if I have this on multi-mono, so I'll set this on channel 2. So there's the snare and channel 1. And there's the kick. And you can see that they're independent. If we switch this to multi-channel, we do lose that metering function, but we can also see that the kick is influenced by the snare when we're in that mode. It's useful to manage your compression when you have unbalanced left and right signals that you need to keep that way. That's what's new with the FX pin window. Up next, we're going to take a look at what's changed for the ReaVerb plugin, the built-in convolution reverb. The changelog says, add channel tool to allow combining multiple files by channel, support up to 64 channel impulses, load channel count configuration from presets, reverse impulse modifier can apply to all channels or single channel. This is a multi-mono only plugin, so it will process each channel individually as they come in, whether it's 4 channels or 2 channels or whatever. Let's go to add and go to file, and I'll import a stereo impulse response. So it looks like this, and I'll just normalize this. So channel tool allows you to create multi-channel impulse responses for processing multiple channels of audio on the input. Also lets you add and subtract different impulse responses from each other, which is not something I've really explored too much, but is an interesting idea. Let's say we've got a 4-channel signal coming in here. So let's just change this to, let's change the track channel to 4 and the plug-in channels to 4. And we've got input 1 and 2, 3, 4, and we'll just process it like that. Each channel coming in on its own input and output. But we only have a stereo file for the reverb. How do we fix that so that it's not passing through the unprocessed signal on channel 3 and 4? We're going to take the source channel 1 and take 2 channels of that. we're going to copy it to output 3. And so now that single file, which was stereo, is now a 4-channel file, and we can see that here at the top, 4 channels. Cool, so we've copied 4 channels. What if we wanted to move this channel over to channels 5 and 6? We could do that. So we've taken our original stereo file, which defaults to channels 1 and 2, and then we've copied it over to channels 5 and 6. And channels 3 and 4 will pass through unprocessed. Let's actually change this to 6 channels, just so that everything matches. And I think that's the most common way for this to be used. And by the way, if you wanted one input to come up as multiple outputs, we would just go here and clear all and do something like this. So channel 1 input goes to all channels of the plugin. It would see the same input, but we can put in different impulse responses. And then for the output, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. With the configuration I have right now, I've got an impulse response that looks like this, and an impulse response that looks like this. Using the channel tools, I've made these input 1 and 2 go also to 5 and 6, but also there's a different impulse on channels 3 and 4. This can be very confusing to set this up. Actually, I had to make a diagram just so that I could understand this myself. For a 6-channel input with 3 separate stereo impulse responses, we'd have to set it up like this. The file that we want on channels 1 and 2 has to be last in the chain. What we want on channels 3 and 4 goes at the top of the chain with a file, a channel tools. And if we want to adjust that separately, like you've seen here, in this section, using the trim gain stretch function, that would go in the 3rd position. And then channels 5 and 6 would go towards the end, but not the very last one in the chain. It is confusing, and I think that this may be improved in the future. This is the way you would do it if you didn't have those multi-channel impulse responses. You could always just drop in all those wave files into separate tracks, route them to different channels, and export that as a new impulse response with the channel order that you want. But without that, this is how you would do it. So again, this is something that I don't think most users will need, but for those that are working with multi-channel files, are working with multi-channel impulse responses, this is going to be a great improvement. Now let's talk about the new plugin included with this update, ReaLimit. This is a Brickwall limiter, very clean sounding, and a great addition to Reaper. Let's have a look. The changelog says, add new program-dependent Brickwall limiter plugin, support embedded UI, support up to 64 channels, optional multi-mono and multi-stereo modes. So here's the plugin. We've actually seen this in a previous video on mastering with stock plugins that was just released last week. I really like it. It sounds very clean, and it has a great UI. I'm going to play back this track without any limiting on here. Nothing special, a bunch of synth stuff, some drums as well. And so having the ReaLimit plugin on the master allows us to make this much louder sounding. And we get to see this really cool UI, which has a gain reduction meter with a history. We've got zoom in and out via mouse wheel. If we right click, there's a few other options here. Metering for left and right input. And again, if we go to plugin pin connector, we've got stereo, multi-mono, multi-stereo in there. Very simple controls, a threshold and a Brickwall ceiling. So if you're familiar with recomp, this works a little bit differently. So with recomp, if you turn down the threshold, then it starts working. With ReaLimit, as you turn down the threshold, as with a lot of other Brickwall limiters, that's going to increase the input gain. When you turn down the ceiling level, that is not the same as like a makeup gain. It's going to be your hard limit for the output level. With the link function, adjust the threshold and the Brickwall ceiling at the same time, which helps you dial in the perfect amount of gain reduction. And then you unlink, bring the ceiling back up to your kind of target level, which would be -1 in most cases. But for individual tracks, you actually use much lower ceilings. But anyways, this is a Brickwall limiter. It's made for making things loud. All right, so let's hear this with ReaLimit on the master, and let's also look at the loudness meter to see what our levels are like. All right, so we're getting about 5 dB of gain reduction on the loudest peaks, and that's mostly from the drums. We've got the threshold at -9.8 and a Brickwall ceiling of -2. So nothing's going to exceed -2, and we can see that here, the loudness meter as well as the track meters. What if we want this to actually be louder? We could increase the threshold, but that's going to increase the amount of gain reduction, and everything's kind of going to impact that. The alternative is to add some limiting to other tracks. So before it gets to the master track, let's try limiting. And we can do that on the drums. And in fact, I've gone ahead and done that for every single track using the link function. And so this is what it looks like on the drums. I've linked them. And so the threshold and the Brickwall ceiling are about the same, 0.2 dB off. I'll just turn that on for the drums, and you can see how that impacts the master track limiter by trimming off some of the peaks on the drums, but not really increasing the volume of them at all. So the drums folder and the instance of ReaLimit there is handling a lot of that, but without really changing the volume. And that's because we've kept the Brickwall ceiling low rather than keeping it up at 0, where it would be a maximizer increasing the volume. So let's toggle on limiters for all the tracks and see how that impacts the limiter on the master track. And now it's only at 2.7 dB of gain reduction on the master track. It sounds very similar, but more controlled. And let's A/B compare. So just turning on and off these. And tonally, it doesn't change that much. This is a very clean limiter. I think you can hear a big difference with the drums, especially the kick and snare. You hear that changing. But overall, it's just more controlled because we've handled the gain so much better coming into the master track by limiting every single sound that comes into it. We could actually increase the loudness. Let's start with limiters on for everything, and let's look at our loudness meter here. So -11, we could get away with another couple dB of gain reduction on the master track, make it even louder without really losing anything here. We'd kind of come back to the same amount of gain reduction we had before. And there, I think you can start to hear it's pumping a little bit, but we are now a couple dBs louder than when we started. So if loudness is one of your goals and you want more controlled tracks, this is one technique that you can use. In recent REAPER updates, we got the ability to normalize while rendering. And so they've added in limiting as well for the certain situations where you need to normalize and increase the level, but you want to keep it below a certain threshold, such as -1 to prevent intersample peaks and leaving headroom for conversion to MP3, for example. The changelog says, add Brickwall limiter option and display gain reduction in render peaks displays when limiting. Let's have a look. So in the render window, we're just going to go to normalize limit, and we've got separate checkboxes for each of these. If I wanted to normalize to let's say -9 LUFS integrated, that's probably going to push the signal level above 0 dB. So let's enable Brickwall limiting with true peak mode and set this to, let's say, -1. So it gives us a maximum level of -1. And so let's call this render limiter test. And master mix, time selection. And actually, let's just do the dry run render. I'll zoom in my screen here a bit so we can see this. And we can see where the gain reduction is happening. That's pretty cool. And it's increased the signal level by 3, kept it at -1. It never went above 0. And so our loudness integrated ended up being -10. We set it to -9, but it had to take off 1 dB using the limiter. So now it's at -10. Hope that makes sense. Now, what if we didn't have the limiter on everything? Let's turn the limiter off on all tracks, render that again just for fun. And in this case, pretty similar result. Ended up being -10.9, so 0.8 difference in there. It increased the signal level by 11 dB, limited it to -1. I also want to mention that this has also been added to the batch converter, so batch file item converter. This has the same normalize and limit function, completely separate from the render window, but applied in the same way. Add support for renaming render presets. I'm going to save this as a preset using the all settings, and we'll call this render with limiting. And now let's look at renaming presets. So I'm going to go to all settings and the rename preset, and in here we see render with limiting in there. If I click on that, it'll bring up a box to rename this. And let's just capitalize some of these words. And there we go. Render with limiting is updated there. You used to have to load the preset, delete the preset, and then save it again with the new name. Much easier now. And now we're going to do some stuff in the MIDI editor. The changelog says add custom note order visibility mode, control drag note key in named notes view, and import export of note names includes custom view ordering information if set. I'm going to go to view and go to mode named notes. This is empty right now, so I'll just double right click to name the note. So let's call this kick, and let's call number 70 snare. And one of the common complaints about drum editing in Reaper is that you couldn't reorder these. And now we can. We can control drag on the snare and drag that down to right beside the kick. So now the note order has changed. And in this view, at least, we're able to program the drums with the kick and snare beside each other. And if we go to a mode like show hide note rows, if we have this set to hide unused and unnamed note rows, now we just have the kick and snare there. And if we want to go back to all, you can go to view, show hide note rows, show all note rows, and that puts it back the way it was. If we want to go back to our customized view, view, show hide note rows, and show customized note row view, and we just have the two that were customized. And as always, we can go back to view, piano roll, and see everything normally in the piano roll view. If we go to file, note CC names, and save that to a file, the customized position will save with that. And if we load from a file, if they had been customized, we could see that as well. So once again, if we wanted to customize the view, we could take our kick and let's say our snare head and maybe the floor tom and floor tom 2, and put them down closer together so that we can edit them more easily or program them more easily. And the last thing is regarding duplicating items with grouping. And this is something that I ran into frequently. The changelog says duplicate selected items, obey item grouping, creates new groups when originals are grouped. This is something that I complained about a few times, and I'm really happy to see that this has changed. So I've got some items here. They're grouped in columns across tracks. Technically, they're the same items and same tracks and all that. They're grouped across tracks vertically, not horizontally. And in the previous version of Reaper, if I duplicated this item and this item would be attached together in one group. So now it makes a new group that is disconnected. Let's take a smaller section of this, let's say a half note section of this, and duplicate that. Again, that is an independent group. It doesn't lose grouping across tracks. It doesn't attach itself to a previous item, which is great. This is exactly what I wanted, and I'm happy to see that. And that's it for this What's New in Reaper update. Thank you so much for watching. Hope this has been helpful. Again, if you missed any of the previous videos, click the link down below. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Support the Reaper blog through Patreon, and visit reaperblog.net for a lot more tutorials.